At this point of the course, you're now an expert in supply and demand, indifference curves, isocosts and isoquants, firm behavior. I want to apply all that together in the factor markets, which is chapter 13. Factor market demand is called derived demand because demand for the inputs comes from demand for the output. So all those things affect demand for the output, and so that means they affect demand for the input. Figure 13.1 shows a very simple model of a firm demand for inputs and the price of that input. So we call the firm in this case a wage taker, which means that no matter what's going on the output, the input markets might be perfectly competitive. So if the input markets are perfectly competitive, the firm is just a price taker on the input markets. And it's going to hire labor until when? It's going to hire labor until the value that the input produces is greater than the return of the cost to the firm. So what does the input produce? It produces output, and the marginal product tells you that. And then the firm converts that marginal product to value by selling it on the market. So the price of the output, or more generally the marginal revenue of the output. So the demand for the input is going to be the marginal revenue product, or the marginal product times the marginal revenue of the output. That's figure 13.1. Page 515 has a cool example of using that formula to get that the marginal revenue of the output is going to equal the price of the input divided by the marginal product of the input. What's interesting about that is that's true for all the inputs. So that means that the price of the input divided by the marginal product of the input is the same for all the inputs. That's what we discovered in the isoquant isocost graph. So here's a different way in which that comes out. Figure 13.3 shows a shift in demand curve for labor. Figure 13.4 not only shows that shift in demand, but it shows that the elasticities are related, which is sort of interesting. Figure 13.5 brings this to talk about the labor market. So the labor market we're all interested in because we're the ones that are supplying labor. We have tastes, and so that means you need an indifference curve graph. Some of us want a high income, so we want to have a lot of material consumption. And other of us have a strong demand for leisure. We want to spend a lot of time hanging around. So the axes of the indifference curve graph are consumption, or physical inputs, physical outputs, and your other asset, which is time, leisure time. The opposite of leisure time is labor. And one of the things that's interesting is there's an extra constraint on this graph, which is you only have 24 hours a day. So on the leisure axis, there's a 24 because that's the maximum time you have. And then on the other axis is consumption. How do you get from leisure to consumption? By selling your labor time. The price of leisure is your wage rate. In other words, whenever you're not working, you're buying yourself leisure. Whenever you are working, you're acquiring consumption goods, which is on the other axis. What's interesting about this graph is it shows what's common in the market. Most of us say, what's a regular work week? Oh, about 40 hours. That implies that everyone wants to supply about the same amount of time. Well, this graph explains why, because the income effect and the substitution effect go in the opposite directions when you think about buying leisure, as opposed to most regular goods where the income and substitution effects went in the same direction. The book talks about Tiger Woods having a backward bending labor supply curve. The section 13.4 is a little interesting because it's talking about the short run and the long run. Really what they're talking about are the other inputs, complements or substitutes for the own input. That really matters about what happens. It also is a way to a little bit to talk about elasticities. Section 13.5 talks about what happens on the output market. If you're a worker, do you care whether the firm has a lot of market power or a little market power? Oh, that's sort of interesting because marginal revenue is less than price. So when you think about the marginal revenue product, that means the marginal revenue product is actually falling. Since we're talking about monopoly on the output market, that makes you think about monopoly on the input markets. That's called monopsony or oligopsony. That's sort of what unions try to do. Well, when that happens, that means that the firm is going to have to internalize that if it wants more labor, it has to raise the price of labor. So the book in figure 13.11 derives the marginal expenditure curve, which takes that into account. It's the counterpart to the marginal revenue curve being different than the demand curve for the firm. And the book talks a little bit about unions directly. And then the last part of the book talks a little bit about other changes in the output markets and how they affect demand for the inputs. So for example, if the market power of the firms go up, that means that labor demand or other input demand is going to fall because marginal revenue is less than price, and that means that that input demand curve, which is a marginal revenue product, is reduced.